Some norms are positive, and guide how we act towards others. And without thinking much of it, we actually adapt to most norms. For example, most people know to shake their hands with their right hand, and they do this without thinking twice. And usually it is not until someone breaks the norm that norms become visible. So there are norms that affect society as a whole and that determine who is allowed power and influence. These two only become obvious when someone breaks them. So few people actually question the normalcy of a woman who talks about her boyfriend, or the normalcy of a man who attends a formal event dressed in shirt and tie. But what if the girl instead talks about her new girlfriend? Or if the boy decides to accessorize his outfit with nail polish? These small changes, they break the unwritten rule for proper male and female behavior. Even the functioning of the human body is subject to norms. Few people who can walk think much of 2 steps leading into a building or the gap between the platform and the train. Whereas these steps or this gap are significant challenges for a wheelchair user. And as far as norms are concerned, it is never considered an advantage to have a disability. But not all norms are fixed. Oftentimes, people who follow or break the norms are perceived differently depending on the situation. History shows us that norms can change. For example, it is no longer taboo in most countries for women to dress in pants. And throughout history, norms have played a great part in which people or groups are discriminated against. Nowadays, women in Denmark, for example, are entitled to a university education. They're not expected to stop working once they have children. But though the norms that determine proper male and female behavior have changed, there are still much that remain the same. For example, there are still relatively few female CSOs. And when it comes to child rearing, women still take the bulk of the responsibility. So norms are about discrimination, power, and influence. And there are consequences for those who break the norms. Homosexuals, transgenders, persons with disabilities, and those who look different may be harassed at school, denied a job, or become victims of racist or homophobic hate crimes. Also, those who break the norms are often lumped together and thought of as being the same. For example, it is much more common to hear truths about homosexuals than truths about straights. There are many different norms that govern our social behavior. And some that we can mention here could be gender and sexuality norms, racial norms, age norms, body type norms, ability norms, social economic norms, and relationship norms. There are also different types of social norms. Folkway is what are the norms that stem from an organized casual interactions, and they come out of repetition and routines. This is, for example, knowing how to shake your hand using your right hand. Then we have something called more or mores. They are stricter than folkways, and they determine what is considered moral and ethical behavior, and they structure the difference between right and wrong. Religious doctrine, for example, is an example of this. A taboo is a very strong negative norm, and it is a prohibition of a certain conduct that is so severe that a violation of it results in extreme disgust and can even expulsion from a group or society. For example, it is taboo to eat pork in some cultures. A law is actually a norm formally enrolled at the state or federal level, and this norm is then enforced by police or other government agents. So the heteronorm is one of the most basic and influential norms in our society. This norm dictates that there are fundamental differences between men and women, and that a person must either be man or woman, and that it is natural to be attracted to the opposite sex. The heteronorm or heteronormativity, as I said, is the concept that heterosexuality is the preferred or the normal mode of sexual orientation. And it assumes the gender binary, that there are only two distinct opposite genders, and that sexual and marital relations is most fitting between people of the opposite sex. So a model to describe the actual spectrums of gender and sexuality is the gender unicorn. And I was actually recommended this model by LGBT+ Denmark, so thank you. And although I am not an expert, I will quickly go through the model, and then maybe Abir can help put some detail on it afterwards if needed. So the gender unicorn provides a breakdown of the differences between gender identity, gender expression, sex assigned at birth, and physical and emotional attraction. So gender identity, that is how I identify. So that is one's internal sense of being male, female, neither of these, both, or another gender. For transgender persons, for example, their own internal sense of gender identity and their sex assigned at birth are not the same. So your gender expression or gender presentation, that is how I look and express myself. So that is the physical manifestation of one's gender identity through clothing, hairstyle, voice, body shape, etc. So for most transgender people, they seek to make their gender expression, that is how they look, match their gender identity, who they are, rather than their sex assigned at birth. So the sex assigned at birth, that is the sex classification that I was assigned at birth. So the assignment and classification of people as male, female, intersex, or another sex based on the combination of anatomy, hormones, and chromosomes. So this is usually decided at birth or in utero and is usually based on your genitalia. Who I am physically attracted to. So that is who I am sexually attracted to, or the group of people or genders to which a person can become sexually attracted to, if at all. We have to remember that asexuals might not be sexually attracted to any genders or any persons. Emotionally attracted to, that is the group of people or genders to which a person can become romantically, emotionally, or spiritually attracted to, if at all. I hope that, Abir, you can help me if I forgot something or got something wrong in your presentation. We also have to remember that there are different norms in different cultural settings. So cultures, they differ in terms of the particular norms that they find important and that guide the behavior of the group members. There are some societies or cultures that are more individualistic than others. There are some cultures that have a high power distance, that is a high power distance society with more hierarchical systems of assigned roles that organize behavior. Some cultures or societies have different time norms. Some societies have a stronger future orientation than others, for example. And then, of course, cultures can also differ in regards to gender equality. Cultures can differ in respect to the extent to which they define different social emotional roles for males and females, and also in terms of acceptance of other genders. Of course, it is very important to be aware of the danger of stereotyping. So no cultural group is homogeneous. There are individual differences in the thoughts and behaviors of members of every cultural group. These are some of the things that we will also be discussing throughout the seminar today, also in group sessions. So to sum up, norms are about power. We are constantly categorized and sorted into groups, and the group that we belong to greatly affects our opportunities to influence society and our own lives. And as I briefly touched upon in the introduction, LGBTQ+ persons are much more likely than the general public to experience discrimination and stigma, both in their local communities, in healthcare, in their workplaces, and they're also more likely to experience violations and harassment from authorities and to experience poor health. A way to talk about norms as a manifestation of power structures and as systemic issues is through a norm-critical approach. So usually when we talk about equality and anti-discrimination, we tend to focus on creating understanding, tolerance, and sympathy for the victims of abuse, discriminations, or offensive treatment. And the victims in focus are often LGBTQ+ persons, ethnic minorities, or those with disabilities. But this approach poses some problems. Firstly, there's a great risk that the norms and power structures that label people as either norm followers or norm breakers are ignored. For example, by only focusing on creating an environment in which homosexuals and bisexuals can be open about their sexual orientation, we miss the reasons why they are repeatedly forced to reveal their sexuality and why heterosexuals are not. In other words, the heteronorm is never brought to the surface. Secondly, we risk assuming that those who are learning about victims of discriminations are not victims themselves. For example, when discussing the matter of whether same-sex marriage should be allowed, it is often assumed that there are only straight people in the discussion group, in spite of the fact that homosexuals and bisexuals are everywhere. And thirdly, we risk simply repeating the norms and not actually changing them. So norms, they cast the deviators, those who do not follow the norm, in a negative light, as either abnormal or strange, whereas the abiders, those who follow the norm, are seen as normal and ordinary. In addition, those who are part of the norm are permitted to discuss and express their opinions regarding the deviators' rights and conditions. For example, the topic of whether same-sex couples should be allowed to adopt is often up for debate, whereas the right of heterosexuals to adopt is never contested. So through a norm-critical approach, rather than focus on those who break the norms, we will focus on the norms that control who are perceived as normal versus abnormal. And we do this because we believe that this method will raise awareness and cause us to question why certain people are discriminated against. And this is essential to create safer spaces where the power imbalances, the misconceptions, and the suppressions that norms create can be tackled as systemic issues and not personal issues. It is not enough to be knowledgeable about the conditions of those who break the norms. Most people, for example, know that women are at a disadvantage to men. And even though each of one of us know at least one woman, these disadvantages still remain. So many different causes for raising awareness on LGBTQ+ issues expose the course participants to homosexuals, bisexuals, or transgender persons in order to increase understanding and stop the discrimination. But this is not enough. We need to learn about how to discuss norms, power, and influence, and how it works in order to bring about fundamental societal change. So for this seminar, in order to try to create a safer space where we can discuss some of the power imbalances that norms create as systemic issues and not personal issues, we have come up with a set of ground rules which should guide our conversation for today. And these rules are basically just good common sense that are very good to have in the back of our head when we discuss very sensitive issues. And the idea is not that you should now frantically write them down, but just take it in and then have it in the back of your head throughout the day. So we have 10 ground rules for today. The first is respect. Give your undivided attention to the person who has the floor. Confidentiality. What we share in the group will remain in this group. Openness. We will be as open and honest as possible without disclosing others, family, neighbors, or friends' personal or private issues. It is okay to discuss situations, but we won't use names or other ID. Right to pass. It is always okay to pass, meaning I'd rather not, I don't want to answer. Non-judgmental approach. We can disagree with another person's point of view without putting that person down. Taking care to claim our opinions. We will speak our opinions using the first person and avoid using you. Sensitivity to diversity. We will remember that people in the group may differ in cultural background, sexual orientation, and or gender identity or gender expression, and we will be careful about making insensitive or careless remarks. Anonymity. As I already said, it is okay to turn off your camera, use an alias, or ask questions using the chat. Acceptance. It is okay to feel uncomfortable when talking about sensitive and personal issues, such as sexuality. Have a good time. It is okay to have a good time. When we try to create this safe space, it is about coming together as a community and being mutually supportive and enjoying each other's qualities. So, this was my presentation, and I think we are a little over time, but if anybody has any questions, please go ahead. Otherwise, we will actually move on to the next presentation, which is from LGBT plus Denmark, Bisexuals. I hope I pronounced it correctly. I don't know if there are any questions. Please just raise your hand or use the chat if you want to if you have a comment or question. No, it doesn't look like it. So I will give the floor to you, Abir. Please go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Cecilia. I'll try to, first of all, share my screen.
Perfect.
I assume it's working.
It is working.
Okay. You would believe by now one is used to this, but no. Yes. So welcome everybody, and I want to thank the organizers so much for having organized the seminar on this topic, especially that is very close to my everyday life and work. And thanks a lot, Cecilia, for setting the scene. You did a lot of the work that then I have more free work here. And I want to thank everybody who's joining from the participants, and please, because I know from the poll that many of you have different sets of knowledge, so maybe some components of my presentation will be boring to some of you, but very new to some others. So please do use the chat to react with me. That's the only way for me to know that, yeah, if you have any questions, so we can answer them while going through the presentation. I'm trying to see how I can show the chat while having the screen, but apparently I can't. But I will try to keep an eye on the chat so I can answer your questions.
We will monitor the chat, Abir, and let you know.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks a lot, Cecilia. So that said, I will start by presenting the program. So through this presentation, I'll be having a short introduction on especially wording, so we understand what are we talking about. Cecilia already started and made a great intro to this, but I would like to go a bit on detail so we really are on the same page when it comes to definitions. After that, I'll just touch a bit on some real life experiences, especially when it comes to violence. Then I will be talking a little about concrete methods, how we LGBT plus Denmark work. And finally, there will be a small exercise and you'll have a chance for also a Q&A. So if I don't get through your questions and from the chat during the presentation, don't worry, there will also be a Q&A in the end. And yeah, so first of all, is of course starting with language, and usually in our workshops we start the first session on language by this quote: language is not innocent. And the idea behind that is sometimes people use words, and as Cecilia put it, in some cultural settings or in when you have certain norms without really thinking of what is behind them. And here it's really important to remember that words have first meaning, second meaning, and other intentions as well. And my next adjusted trigger here, my next slide may contain some words that are not agreeable to read for some of us, but just be aware that they are barred. We are not using these words. So so these are words that it's important to remember that sometimes people ask us to not use some words, and it's really important to not use these words. I know it's very basic, but it's really important to keep in mind, to respect that if a person tells you this word is actually hurtful for me, its words can leave really deep scars. And I took this picture from a Lilo workshop where we have this exercise called trashing the words, and it's a very and the Lilo, when I say Lilo exercise, this Lilo, for those of you who don't know, is a workshop that LGBT plus Denmark carries, both in Denmark and in countries where we have partners. And the point of those workshops is really to understand how violence affects us as LGBTIQ plus people. So it's workshops for LGBTIQ plus people, at least the Lilo identity one. And through the workshops, we have this exercise when we discuss about language, to start actually thinking about all the words that were told to us to put us down, to hurt us, to bully us. These are words people hear in the street, at school, etc. And the point of the exercise is to physically throw these, trash these words. So people will be asked to reflect on what words they have heard, and just write the word in the trash can and bar it. And usually there is this moment of happiness that, yeah, this word is actually bad. And in the picture you can see it is actually from we did a very international workshop here in Copenhagen, where we have people from different countries. And the thing is that you can see that these words exist in every country, in every language, in every accent, in everywhere. We have people from Germany, Denmark, Syria, yeah, and these words are there. And it's for me, what is really an important take here is that even though they are maybe only words, for some people, and we see it again and again in these workshops, they sit really deep, and sometimes people start really accepting these words as their reality, because if you hear that uh, yeah, something you see is red, but you hear it's black, everybody says it's black, it's black, it's black, you end by believing it is black. And that's how, as Cecile explained it in the presentation, how norms become like, just when people decide that this is the norm, everybody starts believing it, even the people who are concerned. So these are some examples of the words we ask not to use, or we are asked not to use. And just be aware that there are words that should not be used. But then if there is words not that we should not use, then there must be words that we should be able to use, because again, people should have ways to be called. And I know for many people who, not like me, don't work on this every day, it might be confusing. There is many words and there's many acronyms, and every now and then we add a letter. I know. But so I wanted just to go through the acronyms and just like why we keep adding letters. So I started by the basic one, the LGBT, and it stands for lesbians. And I know we all believe to know what lesbian mean, but it's usually, it doesn't do a harm to remind. So a lesbian is a person who identifies as a woman, and who is sexually and or romantically and or emotionally and or physically, and sometimes we also add and or intellectually, to another person who identifies as a woman. So here the take is that we have a woman, and there is attraction that is exclusive. So you're only interested in all these ways of attractions all together, or only one of them, to another woman. So that's the L. The G is the same as the L but men. So just is the easy way to do that. Then for bisexuals, and this is the there is many definitions for bisexuals, but the one that in many of the bi plus communities we take is that bisexual designates a person who is attracted to more than a gender. So sometimes you hear that bisexuals are attracted to men and women, and that can be actually a bit excluding other genders. So the definition to take here is that a bisexual is a person attracted to more than one gender. And that can be emotionally, physically, sexually, and or intellectually. And there is and or in all of these. And then we have T for transgender, and trans is a generic term that refers to people whose gender identity differs from the sex assigned at birth. So a trans person were assigned, for example, a trans man, for example, were assigned the sex female at birth, but then their gender identity, their own definition of how they feel and who they define themselves, is a man. So that person is a trans man. But trans in the LGBT acronym actually stands for more than that. It stands both for trans men, trans women, non-binary people, gender fluid people, etc. It's a generic term. So that's the basic acronym, the LGBT. But then, of course, there is not only those people under the umbrella. So that's why in many organizations and groups, there was added a plus, like in LGBT plus Denmark, to say, we acknowledge that there is more people here. So we put the plus to put everybody else under the plus, and to be more inclusive. But in some other groups, then we say, no, actually plus only. Why you mention the L and the G and the B and the T, and the others are under plus, they should be named as well. So usually also when we talk about LGBT, we talk about LGBTIQ, and I stands for intersex, and Q stands for queer. And I will just quickly define intersex for this context. And intersex refers to people whose physical or biological features, such as sexual anatomy, genitals, hormonal system, or chromosomal model, do not match the binary cis heteronormative definition of female or male. So these features can occur at birth or later in life, and generally during puberty. And sometimes also many intersex groups complain that they are left outside of the LGBTIQ plus agenda, and it's a new term or a new addition to the acronym. But it's noteworthy that statistically 2% of any population are intersex. And here to put it on face is like the same as how many red hairs there is in any populations. Maybe remove there some countries, but statistically 2% are red hair. So the same every time you see a red-haired person, then you have probably seen an intersex person. So, but it is a more hidden characteristics. And finally, there is the word queer. And it's interesting in relation to my previous slide about the words we ask not to use. So queer, in some some years ago, was a slur. There was a bad word that is used to insult LGBT people, and it means weird. But as many other words, the community reappropriated the words. It's like, you say this to insult me, I actually take it in and I use it for myself, and I want to be called that. And that's can be confused for some people, because yeah, one day you ask me not to use this word, the other day you ask me, yeah, that's who I am. But maybe it's not that difficult, because if people tell you, call me queer, and I'm fine with that, just use that. If another person tells me, don't call me queer, I don't like this term, just don't use that term to other people. The same with names. Different people had different names. And queer is now more and more used, and it is an umbrella term to mean whoever who is not following the cis heteronormative norm that is used. So if I identify as a non-hetero person and a non-cis, I will explain cis in a moment. Cis person, then I can call myself queer, and it's usually used as an activist identity. And the funny fact now, I feel really old sometimes in this community, because now people are simply not using the LGBTIQ plus anymore. Like when I meet the 16 years old minus, everybody's queer, and that's really refreshing to see that, yeah, like going beyond the acronym to just like, it's a queer umbrella. And then I just wanted to mention that actually there is not only the LGBTIQ plus, it's a long acronym, and this is the longest I could find, LGBTQQI2SAA. But it's sometimes not about the acronym, and it's the acronym changes by the people who use them. It makes more sense to add a letter in some settings, to remove a letter in some settings. For example, in this acronym where you have the 2S, the two-spirit, which is very used it's an identity that indigenous people in America has. and that fits under this acronym, and then therefore it's really used in America, especially in North America, because of the context and the culture. So it's worth noting here that it is not set in stone, it is changing, it is a growing and developing acronym. So don't be afraid sometimes to remove a letter or add a letter. It's okay. So that's the acronym. Then I wanted to say that when we talk about LGBT people, it's also important to talk about allies, people who are not LGBTIQ+, who are supporting the community, all the cis hetero people who are supporting the LGBT community, and they are not put, there is no A for allies on the acronym, because they're kind of another group of people, but they are really important for supporting the rights of LGBTIQ+ people. The same, you have allies when you talk about the feminist movement. Cis hetero men or cis men can be allies in that context. The same when you talk about in racial justice movements, when you have allies to the Black and brown and indigenous people in white communities. They're not the leaders of the movement, but they should stand behind and support. Yeah. Another term I thought here, when we talk about LGBTIQ+, we talk also often, we use another acronym, which is the SOGIESC, and SOGIESC stands for sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics. And I just want to say, when we always, when we talk about sexual orientation, we think about LGBT people, but revolutionary thought, everybody has a sexual orientation. So if you are not a lesbian, a gay, bisexual person, pansexual, etc., you can actually be a heterosexual person, and that is a sexual orientation. Then there is gender identity, and also for gender identity, everybody has a gender identity. We talked briefly about trans people, and that's their gender identity. There is non-binary people, but there is also cis gender people, and cis is when your sex assigned at birth and your gender identity are different. And so you are assigned female at birth and your gender identity is woman, then you are a cis person, and that's a gender identity. So you can be a cis man or a cis woman. Then gender expression, I think Cecilia explained it beautifully. Then finally, the sex characteristics. And this is our, it can be the sexual anatomy, the genitals, the hormonal system, chromosomal model, or these fall into the sex characteristics umbrella. And you can, according to your sex characteristics, you can be assigned female, male, or intersex. It's very few countries that assign intersex at birth, but there are some. And I want to reuse this model that Cecilia used, just to put like all these terminologies into a graphic. Wait, I just want to. Wow. Yeah, I just wanted to put it in perspective of this graph. So first we have physically attracted and emotionally attracted to, and these two is where we see the sexual orientation. and then we have the gender expression that's clear, the gender and identity that's clear, and the sex assigned at birth is where we see the sexual characteristics. And as I said, usually it's assumed to be female and male, but there is another sex, which is intersex. And there is actually 22 classifications the last time I checked of being not female and not male. So I hope that kind of gives us a start on addressing this topic. And so taking it from the naming and who is there in under this group, I as it was said before, because of the cis heteronormative world we live in, people get to be excluded just because of being LGBTIQ+, and it's nothing they done anything wrong about it, but the world sees them as they have done something wrong. And I think the most harmful way, or like when it's supported by laws and it's being institutionalized, it is written in stone that this is wrong. Your country's law where you pay tax criminalizes you for who you go to bed with, or how you look, or how you dress up. You are just going to jail because how you want to dress and look in the world. And it's, unfortunately, this map makes me really sad, because it is an LGBTQ map that shows the laws, sexual orientation laws in the world, where we can see all the red shades are countries where actually there is an actual law text that criminalized homosexuality. And this map only takes the sexual orientation part. So it's being a gay or a lesbian or bi. And in you can check it in ILGA World. They update it every year. So this map is from December 2020. All the blue countries is where there is protection. But as we can see, there is lots of red in that map. I just want to see how many countries. Yeah, so currently there is 67 countries with laws that criminalize same-sex, consensual same-sex relationships. And among those, there is 6 countries where they have death penalty. So you are just murdered by your country because you are gay. Yeah. And also, it's also important to show the nuance where many of these countries, there is also limitations for LGBT groups to organize and speak up about LGBT rights. And I want to give a trigger warning that in my next slides, I will also be talking about violence and concrete examples of violence. So just if this makes you uncomfortable, just so you know, you can mute me for the next 2 slides. And I want to say that I took 2 countries from this map to move from how the laws are actually to how they are. There is also the societal violence and discrimination. So in this map, I chose 2 countries that I have personal connection with. So I'm Tunisian, so I choose Tunisia, a country where you can see in this map criminalizes homosexuality. So the law goes to up to 3 years of imprisonment for gay men and lesbian women and bisexual people. And Denmark, the country where I live, which in this map is actually having some sort of protection for LGBT plus people. Just to show that it doesn't matter the laws, the social day-to-day practices are actually as harmful as the law. Is just to mention that when you have a criminalization and you are being subjected to any kind of violence, not necessarily related to the fact that you are LGBT, if you are if your things are stolen, if you are being attacked in the street just for stealing your bag, because of the way you look and show in the street, and sometimes because being LGBT is criminalized in the country, you can just go to the police and say, hey, I've been robbed. So there is that nuance. I want to say why criminalization can be important, and decriminalization is important for many of these countries, and the activists working towards decriminalization in these countries is to just have that extra right. But on a societal level, actually, sometimes we see the same practices, whether the country gives protection or criminalizes. And I take these statistics from a study that we did in LGBT plus Denmark about for pupils in schools in Denmark. There was a group of pupils who were questioned different questions, and from the interviewees, 93% of the LGBTQ plus pupils in Danish schools have experienced homophobic or transphobic insults in their school during their, and that's 93% in a Danish school. Also 7 out of 10 of the pupils as questioned say that they have they experience homophobia and transphobia in school at least once per week in their school life. This is, for me, that this report came as a shock, because for me, seeing how you're in, we are in Denmark and so on, I'm like, yeah, it's not an issue anymore. But when you see 93% of the pupils have this experience, it shows how the social norms actually sit really deep in a society. Even that Denmark is one of the first countries to allow same-sex partnership officially. The first country in the world to allow gay couples to be registered as partners, and still the day-to-day practice is still homophobic and transphobic. My second example is also from schools, but in Tunisia, where a study was done in 2016 to see how LGBTIQ plus people experience violence generally in the country. But this specific example was asking the interviewees about the surveyed population about their experience in school. And then, and here we see that more than 22.4% of the surveyed have experienced sexual harassment in school, and 20 out of 40 have experienced rape in school settings in Tunisia. And this in the interviews, it shows that the surveyed, they assume that the reason they were attacked like this is because they are LGBT. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, and of course, these two examples are maybe seem extreme, but violence against LGBTIQ plus people has many forms. it can go from, yeah, saying these words that I mentioned again and again, that seem innocent, but they actually do hurt a lot. But it also goes to a joke that may seem not at all bad, but in reality it puts a lot of stigma on the community. But it's also sometimes go by assuming in a work party, asking somebody, hey, how is your husband, where the person is a woman, and asking them, yeah, how is your husband doing, already erasing that person's identity. And yeah, and what I want to say here is that all these shapes and different forms of violence, the words, the jokes, but also hitting people, being criminalized, has deep effects on the communities. And again, I took two examples from Tunisia and Denmark, and back to the same reports from the students on the same group of interviewees, where out of the pupils asked in LGBTIQ plus people asked in Denmark, 24% say they actually don't like going to school. 24%, while the national average in Denmark is 6% of the pupils say they don't want to go to school. So we can see that among the LGBT groups, there is much more repulsion of that environment. Also that people are they feel isolated, and they miss to have social connection in their school environment. Out of the LGBTQ plus students asked, 44% say that they actually feel lonely. It's in the school environment. They feel the lack of a social having to school comrades in connection with them, while the national average is 6%. So we can see how being LGBT is actually really harmful on the I'm just checking the time, sorry, harmful on the community. I think I'm over time, Cecilia, right? Sorry, I'm like...
You're not over time yet,
okay.
But
okay. How much do I have left? Sorry.
You have with this in the agenda, you have 20 minutes left, but that's also for group work.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah.
Okay.
We can go a little over time. We have a buffer.
Okay. Thanks a lot. And back to the example in Tunisia, also we saw in the interview is that a bigger portion than the national average of a bigger portion of LGBTIQ plus people experience lack self-confidence and suicide attempts. And for me, these two slides are just the best answer to people who say, yeah, and being LGBT is a choice. I don't think any human being would choose to be LGBT just as one day I wake up and I'm LGBT, when you know that the everyday violence and how that affects your mental well-being is actually deep. And also for me, these two slides also show that sometimes a joke goes really deep in your own self-worth and how you internalize that hatred. I think I will skip this. Yeah, I think just to not stay in a very negative zone, um, I I just wanted to share how we do our work, um, and we have a whole theory of change and so on. But I think the most important part for our work is we have three principal approaches that if you want to work with LGBTIQ plus people, ask the LGBTIQ plus people. I don't think there is any country in the world that doesn't have LGBTIQ plus people. Many world leaders claim that in this country we don't have LGBT plus people, but they're there and they're not going anywhere. Um, so if you are thinking about including LGBT work, whether in your work or want to learn more or something, just find the LGBTIQ plus organizations in your country around you, just ask them. Don't plan on their behalf. Um, so our first principle in the way we work in LGBT plus Denmark generally is nothing about us without us. We are the people concerned. This affects our everyday life. Just do reach out. Then in our international work, um, because I am actually, now I remember I didn't introduce my what I do as for a living. I am I am the Swana region program manager at LGBT plus Denmark. Swana is the new name for MENA. So Swana stands for Southwest Asia and North Africa. And in my work, we do work with partners. Oops. In can you hear me? Yeah, with partners in Tunisia and Morocco and other countries. We also have a program in East Africa, and our main, very put basically, principle there is do as the local partners say. They are, again, they are the ones with the knowledge. They're the ones who live there in Tunisia. They know better what to do for their rights. And our final principle as we are in this together is really working in solidarity with the groups. We are an LGBTIQ plus organization who works with LGBTIQ plus organization. In Denmark, LGBT plus Denmark have existed for 70 years. We have an experience on how to challenge the violence and so on. And we try to support our partners following what they say, but with our experience in working together to make the world a better place. But also we learn a lot from our partners. They are younger, we are an older organization. They know new things that my organization is a bit too old to know. And we use different methodologies, but one methodology that we keep getting back to again and again is LILO. And LILO, I mentioned it before in the beginning with the trashing exercise, stands for looking in, looking out. And basically, it's a methodology that follows these three principles, as that it starts by the individual. It starts by connecting to the personal experiences of one's, and then it gives tools to how to go with it. And we do, we have, it's a toolbox, as I said. So we have LILO workshops that are for LGBTIQ plus people specifically. We have a LILO workshop for women only. We have LILO workshops for allies, non-LGBT plus people, on how to work and approach LGBTIQ plus people. And all of these methodologies are usually workshops. So they go from 1 to 3 days workshop that mainly aim to create a space. Especially when we work with partners, these workshops are happening in a context of violence and where LGBT plus people are being attacked on everyday basis. But then the LILO, especially the LILO Identity Workshop, which is for LGBTIQ plus people, aims to create a safe space, just some time for being together with other LGBTIQ plus people and having an option to heal and to reflect on how my identity affects me, but also that I'm not only LGBT, I'm called in the street every day on being bad words about my sexuality, but I'm actually more than that. I'm a family member. I go to school. I'm a student, or I'm a migrant in a white majority country, and I'm brown, etc. There is all these identities that we tend to forget because we are only looked at as queer, but these workshops give that space to actually discuss. And I think for this, the participants here, I assume that maybe a more interesting workshop is the LILO Connect, that is addressed mainly to non-LGBT people and organizations to use an analysis of values and where values come from and why do we have these values and these norms, to go to why are we like this towards LGBT people and how can we change our attitudes. Maybe don't love me as a person, but just don't insult me in the street. Like, these are what these workshops are about, and they use empathy and dialogue. And there's I think what maybe why this matters for you is sometimes maybe there is like smart campaigns and videos and so on, but I think in the context of making first step towards better attitudes towards LGBT people is to start a dialogue and have a person see an LGBT person. So they're not talking about them in the general kind of, they exist in the sky or something. They are there, they are in close to you, and you can just have a face on the person and start a dialogue. That should be facilitated and safe, of course.
My name is...
Yes, it's good.
Yeah, good.
I'm 31.
28.
I'm born male by gender identity, but after some time, that was 2011 to 2012, it's when I realized myself that I'm different from the other people. Now I feel like not a male as such, but I feel myself as a female. So in short, I can call I'm a trans woman, I'm a transgender. When I discovered myself that I'm a transgender, it was a very big challenge to my side because I was not even accepting myself because I was nowhere where I was. That's why I'm saying to say it was a challenge because I was living in fear, in a denial manner, to say to whom now I'm going to tell this, or what will be reaction to me being a transgender within the community. The first person to tell him was my best friend. Now my friend and I were knowing that I'm different from other people within the community. Then it was 2015 when the landlord chased me from his compound. It was a very painful, and I hated myself on that day. All the reasons behind are just because the people discovers me that I'm a transgender person.
Yeah, my name is Gift Trappens, the director of CEDEP, Center for the Advancement of People. This is an LGBT organization based in Malawi. CEDEP is one of the pioneers on LGBTI rights or advocacy in Malawi. The organization started in 2006. Basically, to challenge the discrimination, the oppression that the LGBT community face in Malawi. As an organization, we work with the community. We are a community-led organization, Our approach is to work with peer educators in different programs that we have. We have healthy and HIV programs, and also we have human rights programs, specifically also focusing on violence against the LGBT community, but as well access to justice.
My name is I became a peer educator because I wanted to give and support my friends out there who are key populations, just as I am. So what motivated me was that a lot of friends that I have were unable to access services like in the hospitals or wherever, just because they are, or we are, in a group that is not, approved by the society out there. As a peer educator, it has helped me to access services in the hospitals, police, and other services that need to be accessed by every other person who is a human being. And it has also helped me to give the same support to other friends who could not access services by them. When I go out there, meet with my peers, we discuss on the challenges that we go through day by day, how we can tackle the challenges, and of course give them assistance and some counseling depending on how life can go.
LGBT people tend to face a lot of harassment and a lot of discrimination in health service delivery. In most countries across Africa, it's very difficult for LGBT people to just walk up to a health facility and confess that, I'm gay and I think that maybe my sex practice may have something to do with what I'm suffering from. So generally speaking, they get to access general health services, like if they're suffering from malaria or they have smallpox, but they find it really, really difficult to discuss issues of sexual and reproductive health with health workers. And this fear is not unfounded. There are so many cases of health workers who have been even abusive, violent to LGBT people. There are so many health workers who have outed LGBT people to police authorities, to their own relatives, when they do find out that a person is LGBT. In different parts of Africa, but specifically in Uganda, Kenya and Malawi, there have been some issues with health workers who genuinely think it's their duty, their moral duty or their legal obligation to report LGBT people who come to them. The discrimination that LGBT people generally face tends to discourage them from seeking HIV/AIDS prevention, treatment and care services, and that increases the burden of HIV among the key populations. So we want to look at how that manifests for people in the health sector, but also what steps are being taken to try and address this challenge in order to increase uptake of HIV prevention and care services and reduce the HIV incidence among LGBT persons.
I can't just walk into any public health facility as an LGBT person. Because if I am going there for any STI screening, the medical practitioner will ask me, where's your partner? And if I go with my female partner, they'll be like, no, we need your partner. But you try to explain to someone, this is my partner, and they're like, how? There's no way a woman and a woman can be a partner. We need your partner. So you'll find that at the end of the day, I don't get the services. If I am a gay man and I have the anal warts, I go to the hospital and tell, how did you get this? Since when? Then you try explaining to them, they are like, no, let me go and bring my Bible. Let me read it out for you.
The experience we're having when we go to the hospital, if I go as a general public, at a such point we don't feel any challenge. But as far as I explain my own problem which I brought, for example, maybe I'm having an sexually transmitted infection. For example, I'm having something in my anus. I know they will be going to ask me why this happened. So that that's why there's coming a challenge to say why and how. So sometimes we live in a denial. We don't go because we're having a problem, but we're going to the hospital because we are in fear to say how I am going to explain it and how shall a nurse receive it.
My name is Susie McLean and I work at the Global Fund for AIDS, TB and Malaria. So the Global Fund's had a long-standing interest in serving these populations, key populations, both with kind of traditional, if you like, HIV prevention, testing and treatment services, but also in human rights interventions to address HIV vulnerability, to ensure that people are less vulnerable to HIV transmission, but also to accelerate or to break down barriers to services so that all people, including men who have sex with men, transgender people, have the same rights to service, to a high quality service as everybody else, so that we know that many men who have sex with men, for example, or transgender people are either not accessing HIV services out of fear of poor treatment, discriminatory treatment, but also that we know that many sexual minorities or key populations, when they are accessing mainstream health services or HIV services, that they're often treated poorly, they're treated in undignified ways, their privacy is breached out of discriminatory processes that sometimes get called HIV stigma, sometimes are related just to HIV itself, but also many of us know that some of these stigmatizing and discriminatory practices are born from discriminatory practices or beliefs by healthcare workers that are about sexuality.
One of the reasons why the marginalization of LGBT people and the dehumanization of LGBT people in Uganda and Kenya and Malawi is so deeply entrenched and so difficult to address is that in most cases it's actually done by duty bearers, by the people who are charged with the responsibility to protect the rights of LGBT people. So you find that in most cases, people like police officers whose job it is to protect the life and property of everybody in the country will play favorites, with obviously the LGBT people never being the favorites. So many cases have been handled where LGBT people have been the victims of violence, and in response, the police has arrested them instead for being too gay, as though there is a problem. They cause the violence for themselves by just being queer. So this has made it very, very difficult for violence against LGBT people to be effectively addressed when all the time we have to work against the idea of police officers, of local leaders, of military officers, of politicians even, of their elected representatives in parliament, in the state, actively campaigning against their rights and taking active steps to violate the rights of LGBT people, to pass new laws, to find new ways to dehumanize and to mistreat LGBT people in Uganda.
LGBT persons have to interface with these people, whether they like it or not, because the life that we live, including LGBT persons, is shaped by the services that these duty bearers are actually providing. So you find that, for example, you live in a village and you have the chairperson of that particular village. So anything you want to do at that village, you have to get in contact with this chairperson. If it is the police, you still have to get in contact with the police. If it is a health worker, you still need to go to a hospital or a clinic. You still find these people, so you can't avoid them. But unfortunately for LGBT persons, they find that because of the beliefs, because of the environment, and all that thing, that when they face these people, they don't actually get what they expect from them, because the treatment sometimes is discriminatory, and they, in most cases, face a lot of violation from these very people that are supposed to help them.
I'm Bishop Evans, and I'm a preacher who preaches in the slums. I used to hear, but not see, because I didn't just want to see. But the first time I met a man kissing a man, I had to stop, and they were also shocked because I had to stop and stare at them, and they also stopped. and stared at me, and we looked at each other, you know, and they were also, I think they were really a little bit scared, you know, and I was really wondering what's going on, you know, a man kissing a man, and I say, what's all this? You know, this is what I've been hearing, but the first time I saw it. But I saw it, but I'm hearing a lot of things. And this also happened in Uganda, and then the president of Uganda said if you're found, and you'll be killed, you know, something like that. And though we didn't really like, I didn't like it, but I didn't like what he said should be killed. Should we make other people love others and hate others? Jesus did not do that. He didn't love others and hate the others. No, he loved them all.
As here we have really focused so much on duty bearers because we have learned that even the laws themselves that we have in place are not the sole reason why LGBT persons are violated. There's beyond the law, there are people with those opinions that eventually shape what the law looks like. So what we are doing is to reach out to those particular people who have influence and shaping. So we are meeting them, having dialogues, respecting, of course, their opinions, but also giving them the side of living reality of LGBT persons. We have found that actually there's a lot of misinformation when we dialogue with these duty bearers, that some of them have been acting on misinformation. They don't have the real information about the lives of LGBT persons. They don't understand diversity.
My name is Evan Sokuto. I'm a police officer from Kisumu, that is Nyanza Regional Training Center, Kisumu. We police officers, we are rough, if I'm sincere. And when we heard of this, of LGBTI, we thought that these people, we have to eradicate them. We have to deal with them because this is bad to our society. And we were thinking about the upcoming group, the small group, the adolescents and whatever. How will these people cope? They will copy from these people silently. So we have to deal with this group before the sensitization. But they came to our institution and they say that we need to talk with our bosses and the juniors. They have information they want to share with us. That is when we realize that these LGBTI, we have to accommodate them in the society. But initially, it was quite difficult. And even other areas where the information have not reached there, I think there are other police officers who still have difficulty to understand, even to accept that this group is existing in Kenya.
If someone is victimized, you find that that person cannot report the case to the police. They are afraid of being treated as victims themselves. We have criminal laws that criminalize same-sex relationships. So whenever they go into the police station, they are looked at as criminals because of the laws that we have. I think for us, the first thing that we need to see is to change the law so that we decriminalize same-sex relationships. We have a legal framework that can treat all citizens equally.
So, unfortunately, we had to cut the video a little short, as there was still some time left. But I hope that it gave you an idea of the realities in these three countries, and also what some of these CSOs do to try to counter these problems. We are running a bit behind in time, so now we would actually like to have a sum-up session just to discuss some of your reflections regarding this video, but we will have to do it quite short. What we had planned was to discuss if any of you have identified any specific gender norms present in the video, and also some of the concrete methods that DCSOs use to combat harmful gender norms she identified. And I don't know if anyone has a comment, also it could be a question regarding the video, some of the things that were presented there. I think we'll just take it in plenum. There is a question from, so that is true for the other session. I don't know if anybody has a question, a comment regarding the video. Please just raise your hand or write in the chat. No, I can't see anything. I think that if there's no immediate comments or questions regarding, I think we will have to go to pass on to the next session. And as I also said in the introduction to the video, in this next session, we will welcome Mr. Edward Mbasa from Uganda. He is the Deputy Executive Director of Human Rights Awareness and Promotion Forum, who's also presented in the video. So I think that without further ado, I will say welcome, Edward. The scene is yours, the screen is yours. If you have a presentation, you can share it using the share screen button. I can also assist you if you would like. Please just let me know.
Yeah, thank you, Cecilia. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
The internet here has been challenging me on and off. So you can actually go ahead and share my presentation that I sent you. It's still the same, so there is no difference. And I want to pick it from where the video has stopped to.
Yes, I will.
Yeah.
I will just share your presentation. Just a second.
Okay, that's fine. So because my presentation was supposed to focus on how do you now then ensure that in the midst of this discrimination, you sustain access to health services and justice for LGBT persons. And I would like to start from where all of us have been discussing that in Uganda, like many countries, same-sex relations are criminalized. And they are criminalized both within our constitution. For example, the constitution bars marriage between people of the same sex. So that's where it starts. And then we also have the penal code, which basically criminalizes same-sex relations as unnatural offenses. These are termed as offenses against the order of nature. But then, using these particular provisions, homosexuality is actually criminalized. So that is the issue, because in the cases that have come up in the court, there have been efforts to link unnatural offenses to homosexuality. So now you have here sexual identity and gender identity somehow a little bit covered in there, and that people interpret these particular provisions differently. So you'll find that law enforcement will actually arrest you if they suspect you're gay, although the law does not necessarily criminalize being gay. It is basically a sexual act. But depending on who is implementing it, you'll find that LGBT persons will be arrested, all of them under that particular provision. And so this legal framework, and of course, even other laws, beyond just those that directly criminalize, we have laws that indirectly actually affect LGBTIQ persons. So we have laws like, for example, the NGO Act, which basically has provisions that relate to aspects of you cannot operate, you cannot get a permit if, in the view of the Bureau, your objectives and aims are prejudicial to the interests and laws of the people of Uganda, to the laws and the interest of the people of Uganda. So you find that if you have an organization that is going to promote, for example, access to health services for LGBT persons, you might actually fail to be registered. And we have a case in Uganda for SMAG, where we went to the Uganda Registration Services Bureau to register sexual minorities in Uganda. And the registrar said, first of all, that the name was undesirable, so they couldn't reserve the name because the objectives of SMAG are aimed at promoting an illegality within our penal code. So that's how they link it. So in a way, you end up not being registered. Now, beyond the laws, you have this prejudice, you have homophobia, you have people who have been brought up and are told that people who are different are actually abnormal. They are not supposed to exist in society. And all this kind of religious background where they are talking about issues of homosexuality and all that shape this in society. Now you come in and you need to make sure that people who are taken by society in that perspective access justice and access health services. When HIRAF started in 2008, we did a study, and that study was supposed to assess the levels of human rights awareness as well as promotion. We slotted in questions about key populations, and our specific question was, for example, what is your view about homosexuality? And probably what do you think about sex workers? And what we got was some people actually even chased us away when we were collecting the data. I said, you guys, I don't want to see you here again. I'm not giving you any information regarding that. Just go away. Others were saying that these are not human beings, they're animals. They're not supposed to partake in any service that we are providing. Don't talk about them again. So that shaped our perspective around where do we now go in terms of human rights? Because by that time we are simply coming from university and trying to help people. We thought that. So when we heard that was the situation, in 2010, we decided to establish a legal aid clinic that focused specifically on providing legal aid. Right, Cecilia?
I just say, just let me know if I need to change the slides.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. So when we started the legal aid clinic, we started receiving cases. One of the things is that is past 2009 when the Anti-Homosexuality Act had been introduced, bill by then had been introduced in Uganda in 2009. So violence increased because of these conversations around the issues. And people who were suspected, for example, BK, were violated. This random violation, either by law enforcement or even people within our society themselves, they suspected you, then they will actually violate you. And we had now the media also coming in, producing faces of people who were suspected to be homosexuals. And these were actually being mistreated and evicted from houses. Now, when we started the legal aid clinic, it was too much. There was so many cases. And then some people were fearing actually to come out to report these kind of cases of violations. Cecilia, move forward, and Cecilia, please go to another slide. So we started by thinking that there was need for empowering the communities and engaging them in order for them, first of all, to be able to know their rights, because you are now speaking from a point of where people are not even aware of their rights. And even when they would be aware of their rights, they have been denied access to this information through discrimination. They cannot participate. When we did our study, we found that there was no human rights organization in Uganda by that time that had integrated awareness of rights for people that were marginalized, especially those that were sexual orientation, that had a diverse sexual orientation. So not even sex workers. So these they had been denied access to this information, and there was no way you are going to promote justice when people are not demanding for it. So we started programs to reach out, to create awareness. But then we also realized that even then, the cases were not coming. People were not coming out to report. People were not coming out to seek services. We initiated the program of paralegal training. And we started training paralegals, working with grassroots communities that were formed and led by LGBT persons themselves. So these groups would identify the members within their communities that were important or were already engaged in activism. And we would identify these particular members, and then we train them at paralegals. We give them basics in laws and how do you deal with the justice system, the police, the judiciary, the courts, basically the LCs, to make sure that at least they identify, report, and handle fast processes around cases. That increased the number of people reporting violations because they could confide within these paralegals. And it also gave them an advantage to be able to document, because we gave them skills on how do you document these violations? How do you deal with people when they are being violated? How do you deal with police? How do you talk to local leaders, the LCs within the system? And we started now having a lot of cases. And for now, as of now, we have trained 115 community paralegals amongst the LGBTI community alone, and they are now being scattered across the country. So we make sure that there is a network that connects with the lawyers at the Hirafu Legal Aid Clinic to make sure that the cases that are reported there's immediate response and that they are followed up. So this, coupled with the awareness that is created around issues of human rights, the entitlements, has created a lot of demand, both for legal aid services to seek redress in violence, but also for health services, because now people know that they have a right to access these particular services. Before, it was quite complicated as people did not come out. But then, in the midst of empowering the communities, and when you see those photos, those are now community paralegals from the communities, and that is where you see the training. They are now trying to discuss among themselves about these trainings. Now, but when we did this, addressing violence, talking to, empowering communities so that they can actually speak for themselves, we found that that was not enough. Cecilia, please, if you may move to the next slide. We realized that, so that is also part of empowerment. Find them where they are. We go to places. We reach them through the organization, and we make sure that Hirafu has established regional legal aid centers so that you are able to bring the services near to the people who are being stigmatized, who are affected. So the paralegals are going to the community, they're making outreaches and all that. But in the midst of doing all of this, we realized that it was not, the violence was increasing. It was not stopping, even when we addressed the violence. Please go to the next slide. In order to tackle the root causes, then we said, okay, this is not enough. We need to engage with the people who are responsible for making sure that these rights are respected. So we initiated now dialogues with the duty bearers, trainings with the duty bearers, talking to them about these issues. And we learned that these dialogues were important in a way that most of these people were acting on misinformation. Just like you saw in the video, a police officer telling you that we didn't know anything. They were not having information. They didn't even know that there are people that were experiencing different challenges from that perspective and the way that they treated them. Some of them even thought that, for example, LGBT persons do not even exist. So some of them who were in these very important positions did not think that. So when we engaged, as you can see here, we are having meetings with the Minister of Health. We have the first photograph there is a dialogue we had with the Equal Opportunities Commission. This Equal Opportunities Commission, it was supposed to take affirmative action for people who are marginalized, but they didn't even know that among the groups they were supposed to do so, they also had LGBT groups. They have never, some of the commissioners had never heard about LGBT persons. So we had a dialogue with them where we brought in LGBT persons, because one of the principles that we work with is nothing for us without us. That you can't talk about issues of LGBT persons, the liberties of LGBT persons, and we're the one talking. You have to take them to these dialogues. You have to open spaces for them to discuss with these duty bearers these issues. And then these people are able to appreciate. So we learned that it is important for you to engage in order to tackle the root causes of violence, the root causes of discrimination from health services. You have to reach these duty bearers who are actually doing this particular job. And then you talk to them, you have a dialogue. So from the dialogues, then we are able to identify that, for example, we had here a dialogue with the Inspector General of Police by then, and then the Minister of Health, then the chairperson and commissioners of the Equal Opportunities Commission. And these people told us that, you guys, we need to talk to officers, to public servants, to health workers who are in these positions. You cannot expect people to start being fine with provision of these services without understanding the realities and what is on the ground. So that's when we started now saying, okay, we need now to do trainings with the different duty bearers. And Cecilia, please go to the next slide. So we initiated trainings first with the health workers and police officers. So we could actually organize trainings with these police officers and then invite LGBT persons themselves to talk to them about the realities, about the arrests that were happening, but beyond the arrests, the violation that they were suffering in the midst of these particular arrests, and also during the detention. With the health workers were brought, and the communities started talking to them about how they are feeling discriminated, how they are feeling that the health workers are not giving their issues priority, and the things that we are not actually making them convenient to access services from their hospitals. We, on the other hand, talked about the legal framework and clearly clarified for them what the law says about these issues, that unless you have evidence that, for example, someone has been found engaging in a sexual act, you cannot arrest them for suspecting that they are gay. You cannot arrest them for suspecting that, for example, they are transgender, whatever you think. So we clarified the laws, and we further assured, because in our dialogues with the health workers, they thought that, for example, if we provided the health workers, they had myths that, for example, if you provided health services to a person who is criminalized, you are also actually going to be arrested. Some health workers felt like that. And all of these issues were clarified. Now, by clarifying these issues and by the communities themselves sharing their lived realities, we have seen a lot of changes. But that is not enough, because when we learn about these issues, when we learn about the problems of the law and how these particular health workers are finding it difficult to exist, to work within the existing legal and policy framework, then we say, okay, we need to do something about this. And when we meet these people and they tell us, you guys, we don't know the things, there is no documented evidence. Now we invented new approaches still. Now we started, Cecilia, if you may move to the next slide. We started now, we started now working with the different people that doing work around these issues to come and make sure that we push as a force. So working together within coalitions, within this particular sector, human rights, health, and all that, to push and devise means of making sure that we bring all this evidence to all these particular stakeholders. Continue, please. So, and we also realize that within, we need sometimes to take a stand and say, no, this is wrong. While we appreciate that dialogue and, you know, engagement and all that, there are circumstances when the situation requires that we affirm ourselves, we be particular, and we tell the people who are violating that this is enough, this should not happen. So a mixture of all those methodologies have really helped us to make sure that there's increase in access to health services, but also increase in access to justice for these particular groups. Continue, please. Yeah, so act with evidence. So because people are telling us there's no evidence, what are you basing on, you guys, to say that this problem exists? So we decided now to invest a lot in research. So you have to invest a lot in research. You have to produce evidence to prove that this violence occurs. So under this, we produce the violations report. We produce thematic researches about issues that are happening. And this helped us to convince, to reach the stakeholders, to tell them that there is already documented evidence about this violation, because some people thought that these were myths. You guys are forming up stories. These things are not happening here. There is no one who is being violated. So we document these cases, and then we take to them, and then we share these reports. We have meetings with them to work with them and tell them that this is real. This is these are studies, and we invest in research. We get ethical approvals for these particular studies. We get we make sure that they are authentic, that they cannot be challenged. So that this is evidence that collected. We work with researchers from universities that are more experienced and acceptable, and then we produce these particular pieces of evidence. And then we make sure the communities also get this information, and then they use it in their advocacy as well to empower them furthermore. Continue, Cecilia.
For your information, you have 5 minutes left for the presentation, just to leave time for questions.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Just rush through because I think I'm almost done. So we don't only look at these issues in isolation. So we intersect them. We meet with police. We discuss different issues and relate to them on what is happening with the rest of the communities, so that they see that's not only about these communities. These issues cut across, and we need to address them in the mainstream as well. Continue. Yeah, so because many stakeholders are saying there are laws, there's a legal framework that is affecting us. So we also make sure that we do reform laws, repeal laws. So we do strategic litigation, file cases to challenge those aspects of the law, are also aspects of culture that promote this kind of violence and discrimination. Yeah, continue. Yeah, so we also thought that we found that in order for activists actually to be effective, we needed to build the capacity of the organizations. So here I've invested heavily in building capacity of organizations of communities that are marginalized, and we make sure that when they have this capacity, then they can speak, they can mentor activists, they can provide a platform onto which these activists actually can base to start raising their issues, and then they collect evidence from the grassroots so that they can push back, and then they mobilize, create demand for services, and then they engage. So that way you sustain access to justice and services. Please continue. Yeah, so staff need to be motivated. I think that's for human resource, but at least I realized that this work is very stressful, it's very depressing because of the issues related to environment. So you need to do self-care. You need staff that are motivated. Like at our organization, we have had so many lawyers resign even after working for 1 week, and they can't put up with the pressure. So we need to make sure that the teams are motivated and that they're working towards a common goal. You need to brief them about the mission, the vision, the values of the organization, so that they buy themselves and continue to push for the work. Continue. Yeah, I think these are just achievements that we can talk about, but ideally the approaches so Cecilia, you can just run through those. I don't think I need to do a lot of explanations because I've been also hinting on some of them. Yeah, so those are some of the things that the communities are empowered, they can engage, the shift, the access to health and improved well-being, because also that is key to this kind of advocacy. People need to look at these marginalized communities as the rest of the communities. You give them opportunities to be well, to look healthy, to access these services, and also feel as citizens of the country. So that way they can push and they can have the platform to start demanding for the services more. Yeah. So maybe just share a few. Lastly, the challenges. We have been existing in an environment where we have got, for example, attacks on staff and our officers. We had even a security guard being killed. All of that is within. And up to now, by the 2016, 2018, those office breaking happened. Police came, we gave them access, they collected the evidence, they made files, but up to now, we have never gotten a report from them about these attacks. And to make matters worse, all the files in the two cases were lost within police. So there are no files now. The civic space is actually shrinking every day. So all of these relate to the shrinking civic space, and you have to continue existing in that. The approaches will also continue to do civic space engagements, advocacy, working with both national and international partners to push through this. Continue. Yes, homophobia and transphobia, those continue, please continue. High demand for service. And now when you create all this and people now demand services, now you have one problem, that either the services are not available, they are not enough, or you don't even have the capacity to provide these services. So one of the things that you have to do is to make sure that as you create this particular demand, then services are available. That's why we reach government. We tell them, include lubricants as essential, things that commodities that key population need to access, because once you create this demand and these services are not available, then it's frustrating. People are going to kind of give up seeking for these services. So that is also another challenge that we have. Yeah, I think Cecilia, that's it really, unless there are questions.
Have a presentation that we will share with you on screen. And now you can see it here in the screen. Thank you very much. As I was Liv told you, my name is Maricruz Granados. I'm the Regional Gender and Programs Coordinator for SOS Children's Villages. It is my role to provide support to all the programs in the different countries in the Latin American region and to provide advisory in order to insert gender as a cross-cutting theme. In this regard, one of the elements or axes that we have taken into account and that it is very significant and important in our region to insert within children's villages is to recognize and to acknowledge the rights of youth and children, of LGBTIQ+ children and youth in our program, and to have our regional position or positioning. In this case, this positioning, the right to care of this target population, is that I want to tell you what our experience has been and what has been the critical path that we have taken forth. So please, if any of you have any questions, it is no doubt, and I have no problem, we can do the questions at the end, or if you want to interrupt, we can do it beginning, whatever pleases you. So if you have any question, please feel free to do it. Okay, so I want to tell you that this originates, this initiative of having a regional positioning, due that it has been almost invisible. The care of this LGBTIQ plus this means that children that do not have a diverse sexual orientation or diverse gender identities. So evidently, this is not the case. That historically, we have not made them visible, that this target population that do require a specific and certain type of care due to the characteristics of this target population, that we have to advocate, we have to have a better care for this population. So we asked ourselves every time we visited different programs and countries, if we have a child or an adolescent, that in most cases, this is during the age stage in which they start manifesting their sexual orientation. So if we have a child, a boy or a girl that manifests that they're a lesbian or gay, what is the position of children's villages? So our stance has always been saying that we are in compliance to the exercise of the rights. However, this was very abstract for the comprehension of the program and for the understanding of the teams. So we needed a positioning in order to say, what does this really mean? So please, next slide. So in children's villages in Latin America, the importance of this position, please, next slide. This allows us to recognize and to acknowledge that there are children, adolescents, and youth. And one more slide, please. That there are children and adolescents that, due to their sexual orientation and their gender identity, are exposed to multiple ways of violence, that their rights are being hindered and violated in a systematic and structural way, and that one of the most important elements for our organization is that these children are susceptible to the loss of care. So they are part of our target population, and we need to provide services in order to guarantee the right of this population and to acknowledge their specific needs. For children's villages in our region, this means to have a perspective of progression, of progressivity around human rights, because we had not identified within the Federation of Children's Villages, even though we have experiences or specific case scenarios or specific case studies in which we have attended and treated these target population, we do not have a position as federation. So for Latin America, this talks about a perspective of progressivity that we consider that will have an impact, not only the countries in the region, but also it will affect and influence other regions. And this is our expectation, that this positioning can irradiate within and outside our region. Finally, what we consider that it is important, and we consider it as the heart of this positioning, is to have enabling environments for care and protection. This indefinite is one of the principles of children's villages. Now, to take into account and to consider enabling environments for LGBTIQ+ population is a challenge. And from here on, we have to create free of all forms of discrimination and gender-based violence. That is why we have been working through our regional gender network that groups different people and members
representantes de cada uno de los países.
and representatives of each country. And we have been working in this subject matter within the network. Please, next slide. Next slide, please. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the regulatory and the situational framework, and also a little bit about the regulation that has enabled us to found and to give the rationale to this positioning. First of all, we must recognize that not all countries in Latin America have legislation that can ground the care of this target population, children and youth. We have great challenges because many countries still have regulations that hinder and violate the rights of this population. Even in countries in the Caribbean, such as Jamaica, Haiti, it's not only that we have cultural violence and structural violence, but we also have a violation, a direct violation, when, for example, you have laws that prohibit or that limit the existence of homosexual people. So taking into account that we do not have a uniform legislation in the exercise of rights of this population, we have to take it as basis the Yogyakarta principles. And the Yogyakarta principles acknowledge that sexual orientation and gender identity are essential elements for the dignity of all people, and that in view that they are essential elements, these are fundamental and basic principles that are included in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, under the principles of equality and non-discrimination that already exist in the Universal Human Rights Declaration, the principles of Yogyakarta tells us that the states are in the obligation to protect, in first place, all people. And when we talk all people, of course, we are including the LGBTIQ plus population that have a sexual orientation and a gender identity that go outside of what we call the heteronormal situation. They are outside heterosexuality. So the states have the obligation to protect all people against homophobic and transphobic violence. Another of the commitments or obligations of the states is to prevent torture, cruel and inhumane and degrading treatment against LGBTIQ plus population. It is key and essential, and this is stated in the Yogyakarta principles, to decriminalize, in this case, derogate homosexuality. This means to derogate all pieces of legislation that hinder the free exercise of sexual orientation and gender identity. As I told you before, the case of Jamaica, for example, in Jamaica, we have laws that criminalize homosexuality. And please excuse me 1 minute. I'm going to close my window because I have all the sun in my screen. Right now it's dawn for me, or sunrise, sorry. Excuse me, thank you. So I was telling you that one of the commitments of the obligations of the states is to decriminalize homosexuality, to forbid and prohibited all kind of discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, and to safeguard the freedom of expression and the possibility to peacefully assemble to all people. When we say all people, of course, our organization in Latin America considers that these principles must include also children, boys and girls, and adolescents and youth that are LGBTIQ plus. So just to tell you a little bit that taking into account these elements, we take as basis the regulations in order to present our positioning and to advance in a progressive way in the implementation of different actions that enable us to protect and guarantee the right to care of the children. And it is very important to tell you that in none of the cases of our protection system within a region do we recognize or it is directly acknowledged that this population has a right for care. So based on this gap that we have within legislation, our organization must take forth an effort to recognize directly that this population has the right for care as similar and equally to the rest of the children, but that it has specific conditions and traits. Please, next slide. Just to tell you a little bit of our region and the gaps that we find within the region, we have two main rights that are always in dispute or in conflict in Latin America. Or actually, I would like to say that this is globally or worldwide. These gaps, first of all, is the right to gender identity, to the possibility that people can express in a free and undiscriminated manner what is or what are the right they have to identify themselves, what is their self-perception in relation to gender identity. This is one of the most complex or complicated rights in order to guarantee, and that it comes hand in hand when there's a discrimination or a limitation or restriction to the freedom of expression to gender identity. Of course, this also hinders other rights like the right to a name, the right to work, right to education, and a series of related rights or consecutive rights when we do not acknowledge our identity. For our region, we have certain advances. A couple of countries in Central America, as you can see in the screen, Costa Rica, where I come from, people can change their identity without any kind of problem. For example, they don't need a psychiatric evaluation or a surgical intervention. Same case in Guatemala, Panama, in Mexico. You can change your identity in gender. In Dominican Republic, which is an island in the Caribbean, it is also possible to do this. And in South America, in Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador in this case, we also have legislation that has advanced. Now, one thing is that you have legislation in place, but another completely different issue is the enforcement or the application of the legislation. And of course, the cultural and structural changes to guarantee the right to identity. I can tell you that many of these countries allow a change in gender identity as long as you have a surgical intervention. This means that this modify everything that has to do with the genitalia of the people. And this is an element that of course becomes a point that hinders and violates the right of people. And we can continue, next slide, please, in order to talk about other of the rights that is commonly violated and that for us is a right to family. That usually is understood of the right to get married or to marriage. But due to the implication that the negativity or the right, or the non-right to marriage, you have other rights in order to create a family. It is not only related to establish a marriage or to have a de facto unit or to have a spouse or a partner, but also it hinders the right to adoption, for example. So for us, more than the right to marriage is the right to family. which is in conflict or in dispute when we talk about this right. However, also in Latin America, we've had certain advances, at least not completely oriented towards adoption, which is a key element of the right to family, and within how you constitute a marriage or a de facto union. But at least in some countries, for example, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Mexico, and Uruguay, we can see that there is legislation in place that promotes or that has that what we call the equal marriage, in this case, equal civil marriage. At least this is a great number of countries in the region. And of course, that we consider that the right to family related to equal marriage and to adoption are highly vulnerable. And I would like to move forward to tell you what has been, and if we can go to next slide, to tell you a little bit what has been the experience we've had. And I think that you cannot see this slide. Okay, there it is. Yes. So please, if you can advance. Yes. Super. Thank you. So these violations to the gender identity and the right to family, how does this translate? This translates into different violations, and we can do click so we can see each type of violence. For children, this is direct violence, cultural violence, and structural violence. These three ways of violence, or forms of violence, we have identified within the programs of children's villages. Direct violence is all that violence that is translated into discrimination and isolation within all kind of institutional and educational spaces. We're talking of schools, churches. We're talking about, and we refer to spaces where you provide health services. And of course, in our case, that we provide services of alternative care for children that have some kind of degree of protection. This becomes more acute and more profound, in which the manifestation and discrimination of violence is being more visible. They receive a lot of labels, for example, to the manifestation of their gender identity. If they are children that are more feminine, they receive a lot of violence. Not only violence of discrimination, but also a much harsher violence, physical violence. They are more susceptible to sexual violation, and especially in institutional spaces. Another of the main forms of direct violence that children receive are even within their families and community environments. And this is a key focus for this approach, for us approach within the organization. To recognize that this population of children, adolescents, and youth receive direct violence within their families and their communities environment, that they are being discriminated, that they are being they're violent against them, that they are being hindered in their rights, and that many times they are exposed to being in situations of street. They lose all the family ties, they lose the ties to their communities, and this results in a direct vulneration and violation to the rights, in which not even the state or the states have a kind of response to this target population based on their specific needs. Within the cultural violence that we can identify is that we have in public spaces, you still can identify cultural violence. This means that there is a discrimination and violence within public spaces. These people cannot express themselves. They cannot manifest their affection in public. For example, when they're with their partner, there's always discrimination, or they're being pointed out in public spaces. Another kind of violence, which is a direct violence, but that becomes a cultural violence in many cases for many countries, is sexual abuse and violence as a method of correction or a corrective method. This is very common, especially for trans girls and also for lesbian girls. Sexual abuse is a way and a form of correcting this expression that the society or that some community spaces, even within families, uses as a corrective method in order to correct this behavior or this practice, which is considered inadequate. Finally, we also have the direct expulsion from the family environments. This means a complete isolation, the loss of all family ties and community ties. And these children, which is our concern that we have within our organization, they remain without any kind of care, and they are exposed to being out in the street. And many of them, many boys and girls in their adolescent ages, and they become victims of human trafficking, and many times of, again, human trafficking and sexual exploitation. So with all these background of what are the different possibilities in regards to regulation and legislation, and which are the main risks that we have identified in our region, in the countries with more so different kind of shades, but in most of our countries, it is evident, even though we have advanced in legislation, that we can identify any of these kind of violence. The Inter-American Human Rights Court has a great amount of study cases, of situations, and of denounces against the states. For example, Ecuador, Colombia, Costa Rica. They have established different sentences against the state for violating and for not safeguarding and not protecting the rights of this population. And I want to make emphasis that we recognize the specific violence that this target population of children and adolescents are suffering. So without this background, the question is, what do we do now? This meant that we had to translate it into a regional positioning. And here I want to tell you, and we can go to the next slide, please, that we have created a statement or a declaration as Latin American Children's Villages. And this declaration allows the countries can guide and direct the services. How we position ourselves as children's villages in front of the states. How we position ourselves as children's villages in front to the rights of care of this target population. We, and I don't know if all of you know, but I imagine that you have been talking and discussing in this network and that you've heard a little bit of our work. We have services of alternative care programs. These services provide an enabling environment that protect and safeguard those children that have lost the family care. But we also work a lot in prevention. We work a lot in communities and with families to prevent abandonment. However, this declaration, due to the specific condition of children without family care, includes services of alternative care. This means, what do we do when a child is already within the system of protection? How do we protect an LGBTQ child within our protection system and within children's villages? I'm not going to read all the declaration. I will not read it because it is very ample and broad, but we have a document that we can share with you so that you can all read it. But I do want to share with you some highlights of this declaration that we consider that is very progressive and that it is very important, especially for all the federation. But especially it is important for the children, for boys and girls that are under our care system. So next slide, please. And I will tell you a little bit of the main content and highlights of this declaration. First of all, and as general principle, SOS Children's Villages Latin America declares that no children, adolescent or young participant in our programs shall be discriminated based on their sexual orientation, identity, or their gender-based expression. For us, this is key. In accordance to the international framework of human rights, as I told you before, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Yogyakarta Principles, our organization takes forward multiple efforts to promote a culture and an enabling environment of equality and non-discrimination. And this is very important. One of the principles that we have in Latin American children's villages is to work in enabling and protective environments. These are two conditions that are essential and cross-cutting for our services, because these children, they have lost their care. They have lost the care of their families because they did not have a safe environment. And our organization, Children's Villages, must provide a safeguarding and protection system for all children. And in this case, we declare and we include the LGBTIQ population. Next slide, please. Children's Villages declares that sexuality is a central aspect of all human beings, and therefore that it is an essential aspect of our expression, of our individual expression. And also children, of course, they have their sexuality. Of course, they have a sexual orientation. And of course, they have a sexual identity and a gender identity. And we must recognize that children also have the right to express the diversity in which they live, their sexual orientation or their gender identity. As I told you, we recognize and acknowledge within this declaration that this population of youth and adolescents is a population that is susceptible to losing care, specifically susceptible to live different forms of violence within their family and environment and community environment. And therefore, there are a population with a high risk of losing care. Next slide, please. So as I'm telling you, these are just the key elements and some highlights of our declaration. The document is very ample, but with this, we confirm that Children's Villages has a commitment of prevention and to provide a response based on the gender condition. And this is something that we cannot leave aside. The condition of children or of the people is fundamental so that we can provide services and that we can deliver services for those children that live different situations based on their orientation and that are diverse of what are the regular or the common to everyone. And what is common and what is normal, at least for Latin America, is that people are heterosexual, at least for Latin America culturally. So we have to deconstruct this stigma. So acknowledging this, our organization must take forth all necessary efforts so that our programs and services can articulate in a response that will be provided and that will provide safe services and protection for this target population. So we acknowledge and we recognize that it is essential to listen and to recognize and to identify, to have data that will allow us to identify where this population is located, where they are, and that we can make them visible. Because currently, it would seem, or apparently, it would seem that we do not have LGBTIQ children, or that children that have a diverse sexual orientation or a different identity of gender identity. So we have to start creating the data. We have to start taking them afloat. We have to start generating services and statistics. And this regional positioning is based on this principle. So the positioning could just remain as just a piece of paper that will accumulate dust within a shelf. But for us, it is essential to put into practice, to make this positioning alive. And I want to tell you a little bit of what are the implications for the programmatic development. So if we can go to next slide, please. One more, please. Within of what we have considered, we have 5 pillars of action. In these pillars and these recommendations that can be found in the document of the regional positioning have been prepared jointly with different countries. So we have an identification of each of the countries that are related to this, that have given their support and that they're committed to implement these pillars. If we can please continue putting forward so that the other bullets appear in the screen. So the principles here is that we can have sensitive training for collaborators. This is fundamental so that we can establish actions that will allow to develop capacities, not only in terms of knowledge, not only in knowledge terms, but also have experience and life experiences. This has to go through the hearts and minds and soul of people. We have to have this who are living in life experience so that we can make this real. So we have a lot of work with the collaborators because we know that many of our collaborators are resistant to this focus. So this is a very important piece of work. Another element is that we have to work a lot, and we have to do this through all the activities of child protection, is to create safe spaces free of any kind of form of violence and discrimination based on gender. This means spaces free from violence and discrimination for the LGBTIQ plus children. And we have to recognize that they're there and that they exist. Another key element is the response to the needs and demands of these children and youth, that they have specific needs. For example, trans children have a world of possibilities and demands that are completely different to a heterosexual boy or girl. In regards to the gender, they have particular and specific needs in regards to their clothing, for example. And in many of our countries, for example, in Ecuador, it is possible that in some stages, they can offer hormones to a population of children that are trans. This is part of what is important, that different countries can contextualize how you interpret and read the needs and the response in accordance to the reality and possibility of each country. Another element that is fundamental is advocacy and protection, and defense, advocacy, and protection. In all these spaces, for example, what I'm sharing in this kind of scenario, like the one that we're sharing today, these are spaces for advocacy, for defense, so that we can improve the protection for this target population. And finally, but last but not least, one of the most important ones is the empowerment and the participation and engagement of children and youth. When we're talking of empowerment of the LGBTQ plus population, as for those boys and girls that are heterosexual and cisgender. So this is a population with which we must empower, that they acknowledge and recognize themselves, that they can recognize that children's villages is a place that will empower them, that it is a safe place for their well-being. And we've had very, very enriching experiences. Recently, we have been able to identify that several children in what we have called in Latin America, I don't know if you know about this, we have what we call the Migrant Caravans. There's thousands of people that are migrating from Latin America, especially from Central America or from Venezuela, towards the United States. And many of these people, of these migrants, are children and adolescents from the trans community. And because they saw that they were in a life-threatening situation, because they could be marked or suffer violence based on their gender situation, and that they're walking towards the state. And they stay in Mexico because this would be the last country to pass the border. So in this bordering country, such as Mexico, we have started providing services to trans children. And it has been very thrilling and exciting to see how the organization has provided them for safe spaces for these young girls that are trans. And many times they even considered that they were not worthy of receiving protection. So through these pillars, we understand that it is fundamental to continue strengthening the development and training of collaborators, to analyze the challenges of this positioning in regards to legislation in the context of each country. As I was telling you, we cannot apply this in Jamaica, in which we know that there's a criminalization of homosexuality, okay? Or in difference to Uruguay, in which Uruguay has a complete and progressive legislation which is aligned to the rights and human rights. We must identify opportunities for partnerships. We must strengthen the approaches as regional and national strategies. We have to make it visible within different instances in the federation to promote this positioning. That is why we believe that this space today is an important space, because we want to translate it. We want to include, and we want to make this, expand this to all the people within our organization. And of course, to insert and to include these pillars of action within the different strategies that we have for child protection, the gender strategy, youth strategies, and of course, for governance. Well, so very quickly, I just wanted to give you an overview of the experience of our positioning. This positioning is just a couple of months, around 3 months old, in which we have launched this positioning. So now the countries are working in order to adjust and to adapt and to incorporate these elements in a progressive way. We understand and we know that this will not be a day to night or a night to day change.